Page 275 continued. Matthew Arnold, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, Arnold, A-R-N-O-L-D, 1822 to 1888, para. In the world of literature, Arnold has occupied for many years an authoritative position as critic and teacher, similar to that held by Ruskin in the world of art. In his literary work, two very different moods are manifest. In his poetry, he reflects the doubt of an age which witnessed the conflict between science and revealed religion. Apparently, he never passed through any such decisive personal struggle as is recorded in Sartor Resartus, and he has no positive conviction such as is voiced in, quote, the everlasting yeah, unquote, stop. He is beset by doubts which he never settles, and his poems generally express sorrow or regret or resignation. In his prose he shows the cavalier spirit, aggressive, light-hearted, self-confident. Like Carlyle, he dislikes shams and protests against what he calls the barbarism of society. But he writes with a light touch, using satire and banter as the better part of his argument. Carlyle denounces with the zeal of a Hebrew prophet and lets you know that you are hopelessly lost if you reject his message. Arnold is more like the cultivated Greek. His voice is soft, his speech suave, but he leaves the impression, if you happen to differ with him, that you must be deficient in culture. Both these men, so different in spirit and methods, confronted the same problems, sought the same ends, and were dominated by the same moral sincerity. Works of Matthew Arnold. We shall better appreciate Arnold's poetry if we remember two things. First, he had been taught in his home a simple and devout faith in revealed religion, and in college he has thrown into a world of doubt and questioning. He faced these doubts honestly, reverently in his heart, longing to accept the faith of his fathers, but in his head demanding proof and scientific exactness. The same struggle between head and heart, between reason and intuition, goes on today, and that is one reason why Arnold's poetry, which wavers on the borderland between doubt and faith, page 276, is a favorite with many readers. Second, Arnold, as shown in his essay on the study of poetry, regarded poetry as, quote, a criticism of life under the conditions fixed for such criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty, stop, unquote. Naturally, one who regards poetry as a criticism will write very differently from one who regards poetry as the natural language of the soul. He will write for the head rather than for the heart, and will be cold and critical rather than enthusiastic. According to Arnold, each poem should be a unit, and he protested against the tendency of English poets to use brilliant phrases and figures of speech which only detract attention from the poem as a whole. For his models, he went to Greek poetry, which he regarded as, quote, the only sure guidance to what is sound and true in poetical art, stop, unquote. Arnold is, however, more indebted than he thinks to English masters, especially to Wordsworth and Milton, whose influence is noticeable in a large part of his poetry. Para. Of Arnold's narrative poems, the two best known are Balder Dead, Balder, Dead, 1855, an incursion into the field of Norse mythology, which is suggestive of Gray, and Sohrab and Rustam, 1853, which takes us into the field of legendary Persian history. The theme of the latter poem is taken from the Shahnameh, Book of Kings of the Persian poet Firdausi, who lived and wrote in the 11th century. Para. Using this interesting material, Arnold produced a poem which has the rare and difficult combination of classic, reserve and romantic feeling. It is written in blank verse, and one has only to read the first few lilies to see that the poet is not a master of his instrument. The lines are seldom harmonious, and we must frequently change the accent of common words or lay stress on unimportant particles to show the rhythm. Arnold frequently copies Milton, especially in his repetition of ideas and phrases, but the poem as a whole is lacking in Milton's wonderful melody. Para. The classic influence on Sohrab and Rustam is especially noticeable in Arnold's use of material. Fights are short, grief is long, therefore the poet gives few lines to the combat, but lingers over the son's joy at finding his father and the father's quenchless sorrow at the death of his son. The last lines especially, with their quote, passionate grief set to solemn music, unquote, comma, make this poem one of the best on the whole that Arnold has written, and the exquisite ending where the oxus, unmindful of the trivial strifes of men, flows on sedately to join, quote, his luminous home of waters, unquote, is most suggestive of the poet's conception of the orderly life of nature in contrast with the doubt and restlessness of human life. Para. Next in importance to the narrative poems are the elegies, Elegies, comma, quote, Thyrsis, Thyrsis, unquote, comma, quote, the scholar gypsy, unquote, quote, memorial verses, unquote, comma, quote, a southern night, unquote, comma, quote, Obermann, comma, unquote, quote, stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse, Chartreuse, comma, unquote, and quote, Rugby Chapel, unquote, stop. All these are worthy of careful reading, but the best is Thyrsis, a lament for the poet Clough, Clough, which is sometimes classed with Milton's Lydas, Lyddas, and Shelley's Adonais. Among the minor poems, the reader will find the best expression of Arnold's ideals and methods in, quote, Dover Beach, unquote, the love lyrics entitled, quote, Switzerland, comma, unquote, quote, Requiescat, comma, unquote, quote, Shakespeare, comma, unquote, quote, the future, comma, unquote, quote, Kensington Gardens, comma, unquote, quote, Philomela, comma, unquote, quote, human life, comma, unquote, quote, Calicles, Callicles, apostrophe S, song, comma, unquote, quote, morality, comma, unquote, and quote, gist, Geist, apostrophe S, grave, comma, unquote. The last being an exquisite tribute to a little dog which, like all his kind, had repaid our scant crumbs of affection with a whole life's devotion. Para. The first place among Arnold's prose works must be given to the essays in criticism, which raise the author to the front rank of living critics. His fundamental idea of criticism appeals to us strongly. The business of criticism, he says, is neither to find fault nor to display the critic's own learning or influence. It is to know, quote, the best which has been thought and said in the world, comma, unquote, and by using this knowledge to create a current of fresh and free thought. If a choice must be made among these essays, which are all worthy of study, we would suggest, quote, the study of poetry, comma, unquote, quote Wordsworth, unquote, comma, quote Byron, unquote, comma, and quote Emerson, unquote, stop. The last named essay, which is found in the Discourses in America, is hardly a satisfactory estimate of Emerson, but its singular charm of manner and its atmosphere of intellectual culture make it perhaps the most characteristic of Arnold's prose writings. Para. Among the works of Arnold's practical period, there are two which may be taken as typical of all the rest. Literature and Dogma, 1873, is, in general, a plea for liberality in religion. Arnold would have to read the Bible, for instance, as we would read any other great work, and apply to it the ordinary standards of literary criticism. Para. Culture and Anarchy, 1869, contains most of the terms culture, sweetness and light, barbarian, Philistine, Hebraism, and many others which are now associated with Arnold's work and influence. Stop, page 277. The term, quote, barbarian, unquote, refers to the aristocratic classes whom Arnold thought to be essentially crude in soul, notwithstanding their good clothes and superficial graces. Quote, Philistine, unquote, refers to the middle classes, narrow-minded and self-satisfied people, according to Arnold, whom he satirizes with the idea of opening their minds to new ideas. Stop, quote. Hebraism, unquote, is Arnold's term for more education. Carlyle had emphasized the Hebraic or moral element in life, and Arnold undertook to preach the Hellenic or intellectual element, which welcomes new ideas and delights in the arts that reflect the beauty of the world. Quote, the uppermost idea with Hellenism, he says, Hellenism, quote, comma, he says, comma, quote, is to see things as they are, semicolon. The uppermost idea with Hebraism is conduct the obedience, stop, unquote. With great clearness, sometimes with great force, and always with a play of humor and raillery, R-A-I-L-L-E-R-Y, aimed at the, quote, Philistines, comma, unquote. Arnold pleads for both these elements in life, which together aim at, quote, culture, comma, unquote, that is, at moral and intellectual perfection. Para. General characteristics. Arnold's influence in our literature may be summed up in a word as intellectual rather than inspirational. One cannot be enthusiastic over his poetry for the simple reason that he himself lacked enthusiasm. He is, however, a true reflection of a very real mood of the past century, the mood of doubt and sorrow, and a future generation may give him a higher place than he now holds as a poet. Though marked by, quote, the elemental note of sadness, comma, unquote, all Arnold's poems are distinguished by dearness, simplicity, and the restrained emotion of his classical models. Para. As a prose writer, the cold intellectual quality which mars his poetry by restraining romantic feeling is of first importance, since it leads him to approach literature with an open mind and with the single desire to find, quote, the best which has been thought and said in the world, stop, unquote. We cannot yet speak with confidence of his rank in literature, but by his crystal clear style, His scientific spirit of inquiry and comparison, especially by his broad sympathy and intellectual culture, he seems destined to occupy a very high place among the masters of literary criticism. Para. John Henry Newman, Neumann, 1801 to 1890. Any record of the prose literature of the Victorian era, which includes the historical essays of Macaulay and the art criticism of Ruskin, should contain also some notice of its spiritual leaders. For there was never a time when the religious ideals that inspired the race were kept more constantly before men's minds through the medium of literature. Para. Among the religious writers of the age, the first place belongs unquestionably to Cardinal Newman. Whether we consider him as a man with his powerful yet gracious personality, or as a religious reformer who did much to break down old religious prejudices by showing the underlying beauty and consistency of the Roman Church, or as a prose writer whose style is as near perfection as we have ever reached, Newman is one of the most interesting figures of the whole 19th century. Para. Works of Newman. Readers approach Newman from so many different motives, some for doctrine, some for argument, some for a pure prose style, that it is difficult to recommend the best works for the beginner's use. As an expression of Newman's spiritual struggle, the Apologia pro vita sua is perhaps the most significant. This book is not light reading, and one who opens it should understand clearly the reasons for which it was written. Newman had been accused of insincerity not only by Kingsley, but by many other men in the public press. His retirement to solitude and meditation at Littlemore had been courageously misunderstood, and it was openly charged that his conversion was a cunningly devised plot to win a large number of his followers to the Catholic Church. This change involved others, and it was to defend them as well as to vindicate himself that Newman wrote the Apologia. The perfect sincerity with which he traced his religious history, showing that his conversion was only the final step in a course he had been following since boyhood, silenced his critics and revolutionized public opinion concerning himself and the church which he had joined. As the revelation of a soul's history and as a model of pure, simple, unaffected English, this book, entirely apart from its doctrinal teaching, deserves a high place in our prose literature. Para. In Newman's doctrinal works, the Via Media, the Grammar of Assent, and in numerous controversial essays, the student of literature will have little interest. Much more significant are his sermons, the unconscious reflection of a rare spiritual nature, of which Professor Sharp, SHAIRP, said, Cologne, quote, "His power shows itself," page 278, "clearly in the new and unlooked-for way in which he touched into little old truths, moral or spiritual, ... And as he spoke, how the old truth became new, ! And how it came home with a meaning never felt before, ! He laid his finger how gently yet how powerfully on some inner place in the hearer's heart, and told him things about himself he had never known till then. Subtlest truths which would have taken philosophers' pages of circumlocution and big words to state were dropped out by the way in a sentence or two of the most transparent Saxon, Of greater interest to the general reader are The Idea of a University, discourses delivered at Dublin, and his two works of fiction, Loss, Loss and Gain, Gain, treating of a man's conversion to Catholicism, and Callista, Callista, which is, in his own words, quote, an attempt to express the feelings and mutual relations of Christian and heathens in the middle of the 3rd century. Stop, unquote. The latter is, in our judgment, the most readable and interesting of Newman's works. The character of Callista, a beautiful Greek sculptor of idols, is powerfully delineated. The style is clear and transparent as air, and the story of the heroine's conversion and death makes one of the most fascinating chapters in fiction, though it is not the story so much as the author's unconscious revelation of himself that charms us. It would be well to read this novel in connection with Kingsley's Hypatia, Hypatia, which attempts to reconstruct the life and ideals of the same period. Para. Newman's poems are not so well known as his prose, but the reader who examines the Lyra Apostolica and verses on various occasions will find many short poems that stir a religious nature profoundly by their pure and lofty imagination, and future generations may pronounce one of these poems, quote, the dream of Gerontius, unquote, to be Newman's most enduring work. This poem aims to reproduce the thoughts and feelings of a man whose soul is just quitting the body and who is just beginning a new and greater life. Both in style and in thought, quote, the dream, unquote, is a powerful and original poem and is worthy of attention not only for itself, but as a modern critic suggests, quote, as a revelation of that high spiritual purpose which animated Newman's life from beginning to end, stop, unquote, para. Of Newman's style, it is as difficult to write as it would be to describe the dress of a gentleman we had met, who was so perfectly dressed, quote, that we paid no attention to his clothes. Stop. His style is called transparent, because at first we are not conscious of his manner, and unobtrusive because we never think of Newman himself, but only of the subject he is discussing. There's no unquote mark. He is like the best French prose writers in expressing his thought with such naturalness and apparent ease that without thinking of style we receive exactly the impression which he means to convey. In his sermons and essays he is wonderfully simple and direct. In his controversial writings, gently ironical and satiric, and the satire is pervaded by a delicate humor. But when his feelings are aroused, he speaks with poetic images and symbols, and his eloquence is like that of the Old Testament prophets. Like Ruskin's, his style is modeled largely on that of the Bible, but not even Ruskin equals him in the poetic beauty and melody of his sentences. On the whole, he comes nearer than any other of his age in our ideal of a perfect prose writer. Para. Other essays of the Victorian age. We have selected the above 5 essays, Macaulay, Carlyle, Arnold, Newman, and Ruskin, as representative writers of the Victorian age. But there are many others who well repay our study. Notable among them are John Addington Symonds, author of the Renaissance in Italy, undoubtedly his greatest work and of many critical essays. Walter Pater, Pater, whose appreciations and numerous other works mark him as one of our best literary critics, and Leslie Stephen, famous for his work on the monumental Dictionary of National Biography and for his Hours in a Library, a series of impartial and excellent criticisms brightened by the play of an original and delightful humor. Para. Among the most famous writers of the age are the scientists Lyell, Lyell, Darwin, Huxley, Spencer, Tyndall, Tyndall, and Wallace, Wallace, a wonderful group of men whose works, though they hardly belong to our present study, have exercised an incalculable influence on our life and literature. Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, which apparently established the theory of evolution, was an epoch-making book. It revolutionized not only our conceptions of natural history, but also our methods of thinking on all the problems of human society. Those who would read a summary of the greatest scientific discovery of the age will find it in Wallace's Darwinism, a most interesting book written by the man who claims, with Darwin, the honor of first announcing the principle of evolution, page 279. And from a multitude of scientific works we recommend also to the general reader Huxley's autobiography and his lay sermons, addresses and reviews, partly because they are excellent expressions of the spirit and methods of science, and partly because Huxley as a writer is perhaps the clearest and the most readable of the scientists. Para. The spirit of modern literature. As we reflect on the varied work of the Victorian writers, three marked characteristics invite our attention. First, our great literary men, no less than our great scientists, have made truth the supreme object of human endeavor. All these eager poets, novelists, and essayists, questing over so many different ways, are equally intent on discovering the truth of life. Men as far apart as Darwin and Newman are strangely alike in spirit, one seeking truth in the natural, the other in the spiritual history of the rest. Second, literature has become the mirror of truth, and the first requirement of every serious novel or essay is to be true to the life or the facts which it represents. Third, literature has become animated by a definite moral purpose. It is not enough for the Victorian writers to create or attempt an artistic work for its own sake. The work must have a definite lesson for humanity. The poets are not only singers but leaders. They hold up an ideal and they compel men to recognize and follow it. The novelists tell a story which pictures human life and at the same time call us to the work of social reform or drive home a moral lesson. The essayists are nearly all prophets or teachers and use literature as the chief instrument of progress and education. Among them all we find comparatively little of the exuberant fancy, the romantic ardor and the boyish gladness of the Elizabethans. They write books not primarily to delight the artistic sense, but to give bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty in soul. Milton's famous sentence, quote, "A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit," unquote, might be written across the whole Victorian era. We are still too near these writers to judge how far their work suffers artistically from their practical purpose, but this much is certain, that whether or not they created immortal works, their books have made the present world a better and a happier place to live in. And that is perhaps the best that can be said of the work of any artist or artisan. Stop.